Welcome back to Mr. Marquise Tutors Me. I'm Mr. Marquise. Right now, we're at Black History Faction, Part 2. I'm in the middle of Chapter 1, Fact or Fiction. And we made it all the way up to the point of Crispus Attucks helping begin the American Revolution. Side note, I definitely appreciate you guys for coming and being here, being back to part 2, and I would want to make sure that you at least watched part 1. So do me a favor, go and find my little avatar, Mr. Marquise TM, hands up, bring it. Yep, that's me, Mr. Marquise TM. Go and click on that if you're at the YouTube page, and go back and watch part 1, please. It's appreciated, man. Hit the like, subscribe, share, man. Leave me a comment. If you're on YouTube, you'll be at the Little Keepers Lit Club. Go and click on that avatar. It'll say Little Keepers Lit Club, Lit Lab. You click on that little avatar. You're on the Facebook page. Hit the subscribe, follow, like. Go and leave a comment on all the videos. Go and watch every video that I have up. This is the 3rd presentation that I have. The first one is an algebra tutorial. The second one is a test-taking techniques tutorial. And now this one here is my Black History. It's more of a review. This is a Black History review. Yeah. Let's get back to the book. Crispus Attucks was immortalized as the first to defy, the first to die, and lauded as a true martyr, the first to pour out his blood as a precious libation on the altar of a people's rights. This story can be found on the pbs.org website in the Africans in America timeline. A statue in his honor still stands in Boston, and the legend of Crispus Attucks is said to be the start of the American Revolution for Independence. Actually, the revolution was sparked by a series of events involving the French settlers occupying the surrounding territories. Remember that French and Indian War? Yeah. In 1754, the French army conquered portions of Pennsylvania and threatened to gain control of Virginia in 1755. By 1756, New France covered land along the edge of the 13 colonies. Britain and colonists declared war on the citizens of New France. Some maps have the French territory as far west as Colorado and splitting Texas in half. The battles for more territory became known as the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War. It's the same thing. French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, same thing. The French and Indian War lasted 7 years. Back to the book. The British soldiers were fighting alongside colonist allies. The first few battles were along the northern border of the colonies, where Britain gained control of Canada. To prevent Britain from conquering portions of Spain's territory, Spain sided with France in 1760. This is according to history.com. Spain occupied land west of the Mississippi River, Mexico, Florida, and the Caribbean islands. Other maps have Spain controlling only from Texas to California. Mexico, Florida, and the islands. Regardless of how the land was mapped out, in 1763, the English defeated the French and the Treaty of Paris was signed. This awarded the British Canada, Florida, and territory as far west as Mississippi. Subsequently, the colonists had to pay King George III for the debt Britain accrued funding the 7 Years' War. So they made the colonies pay the taxes. The king taxed the colonies for goods imported from Britain. One of the most lucrative goods was tea. The colonists boycotted, protested, and smuggled tea from other countries. In December of 1773, protesters boarded ships loaded with tea in the Boston harbor. They destroyed all the cargo by smashing or throwing the chest in the water. This act of defiance became known as the Boston Tea Party, where nearly 100,000 pounds of tea were compromised. That event led to the Revolutionary War, or the American Revolution in 1775. Side note, it only makes sense, right? Hey, we send you this, we send you $1 million worth of stuff, and you just throw it in the water. So you don't get the tea, but we don't get the money. So yes, it's war at this point, right? Yeah. Now back to the book. In 1775, the colonial government that represented the crown, or the king and queen, was slowly being undermined by a group of colonists known as the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty organization is responsible for the Boston Tea Party. To reestablish authority, Britain put legislation in place to cripple and cut off Massachusetts, as well as prevent other colonies from rebelling against the British government. In April of that year, 1775, the first battle took place and was won by colonial forces led by George Washington. In June, another battle was won by British forces. So yes, the colonials won and the British won. Colonials win, the British win. By March of 1776, the British were retreating into Canada. The Declaration of Independence was passed by the Second Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. The 4th of July marked the beginning of the United States of America and is celebrated to this day nationwide. The black community celebrates the 4th of July like we were freed the day the United States declared independence from Great Britain. I did it too. I didn't know any better. Hey, but I'm one of those people that I'm going to celebrate family at every function. At every function, it's just good to see family. I'm a family man. Love my family. But yes, this is nationwide. And these are black people. Yeah. Nationwide. But me, I was just happy to pop fireworks, watch the parade, eat barbecue, fellowship with friends and family. One of the many traditions I adopted from my parents, who celebrated with their parents, and so on. Hispanics, mainly Mexicans, celebrate the 4th of July as well. However, the Declaration of Independence did not end the Revolutionary War. It wasn't until 1783 that Great Britain finally recognized the independence of the United States. After 8 years of fighting and more than 170 years of British control, Americans were finally free. Well, everyone except the slaves, of course. George Washington, commander-in-chief for the colonial military during the war, owned slaves and a plantation in Virginia. He would go on to become the first president of the United States. In 1789, between 1783 and 1789, the Constitution was written. and ratified by all 13 colonies, now renamed the United States of America. George Washington went down in history as one of the forefathers of the free world and lived in the president's house in Philadelphia. He served as president for 8 years and died in 1799. On his deathbed, he emancipated all of his slaves, but their freedom was not granted until his wife died 3 years later. Washington won the respect of his fellow Americans at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Back then, only prominent white men from each state were invited as delegates or representatives. The Constitution consists of rights afforded to all citizens. What was not written but understood was the fact that these rights were for white men only. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. The First Amendment gives the people the freedom of religion, meaning a person has the right to believe any religion or not believe in religion at all. The people were also given the freedom of speech in the First Amendment. So a person can say what they want, true or false, without fear of punishment. The same is afforded to publishers by the freedom of the press, meaning I can write this book without the fear of being reprimanded in any way. Lastly, the First Amendment gives the people the right to assemble or come together and the right to petition the government. Side note, we may have to petition the government soon, but let's get back to the reading. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms or keep guns. Amendment 3 says that soldiers do not have the right to the people's homes without their consent. Amendment 4 prohibits illegal search and seizure and no arrest warrants without probable cause. That is your Fourth Amendment right. The Fifth Amendment speaks of the rights a person has when dealing with criminal cases. It says that one cannot be forced to testify on themselves. They cannot be tried twice for the same crime, nor can their private property be taken for public use. Remember, the Fifth Amendment is the one that where you can just tell somebody, hey, I plead the Fifth. You heard somebody say, I plead the Fifth? Yes. Remember the Fifth Amendment. I won't go that far into the Fifth Amendment. Just know that I use it. Yes, the Fifth Amendment will get you out of a lot of trouble. But yeah, let's go ahead and get back to the book. Okay. Amendment 6 gives people rights to fair trials. Amendment 6 gives people rights to fair trials. The accused has the right to have a lawyer, an impartial judge and jury, witnesses in his favor, and the right to confront witnesses against them in court. Amendment 7 deals with rights in civil cases, and cannot be re-examined in any other court of the United States. The Eighth Amendment protects the people from excessive bail, fines, and punishments. A cruel and unusual punishment, for example, would be hanging. The Ninth Amendment says rights retained by the people can never be denied to the people. In other words, you become a citizen, you are guaranteed all rights therein. The 10th and final amendment of the Bill of Rights gives power to the states. Gives power to the states and the people, meaning the laws of each state are left up to the people, delegated by people in those states, according to constitutionfacts.com, original copies of the United States Bill of Rights are on display at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The President's House in Philadelphia was temporarily known as the capital of the United States of America until the White House was built to house the President of the United States and the first family in Washington, D.C. The D.C. stands for District of Columbia, and at one time more than half of the residents were descendants of slaves. In 1800, a census was conducted in the United States, and of the 5 million American citizens, 1 million were slaves or free black people. 1 million were slaves or free black people. As for the rest of the territory occupied by Spanish settlers, French settlers, natives, and Africans, the story gets lost in translation when it comes to population because, those countries didn't have to tell us how many people they had over here. That's none of our business. We would have to go to like the French archives or go into the Spanish archives for Spain to know exactly what the numbers were, what the census was like as far as the 1800s and then the 1900s and then 2000. You have to go into their archives. Back to the book. The French inhabited 5 colonies of their own, which as a collective were known as New France. France lost the French and Indian War to England or to the colonists and subsequently lost control of their territory. So they sided with the American colonists during the American Revolution. You know what I'm saying? So the French-speaking people that were no longer considered a part of France, they started siding with the Americans in this American Revolution. You know what I'm saying? When it was time to fight the British, yes, those French people helped. And that made it okay for them to stay in America. It's like they didn't get deported back to France. They were like, no, we don't know anything about France. We know America. Why would we go to France? Yes, we speak French. We speak English. Man, I digress. Back to the book. The French encountered a revolution of their own in their own homeland of France. The newly founded United States would not get involved in the French Revolution and, perceived the 40,000 French immigrants as threats to national security. Yeah, so they almost deported them. After Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew the government of France in 1799, he forced Spain to give the Louisiana Territory back to France in 1800. In 1803, Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for $13 million. No, it was $15 million in what was most famously known as the Louisiana Purchase. I'll dive deeper into the significance of obtaining that territory after I talk about the newly acquired states that eventually joined the Union or the United States of America. But yeah, as a result of the American Revolution, the United States gained other land owned by Great Britain or the United Kingdom. Vermont was admitted to the Union in 1791, followed by Kentucky in 1792, once it was separated from Virginia. In 1796, Tennessee was accepted, and in 1803, the Ohio Territory contained parts of 6 would-be states joined the Union. With the Louisiana Purchase, the United States took control of the remaining parts of those would-be states connected to Ohio. They got 8 other states, as well as parts of some states near the West Coast. The French Americans that chose to stay in the U.S. would later accept the Constitution as their own. Louisiana was admitted to the Union in 1812, Indiana in 1816, Mississippi in 1817, and the state of Illinois in 1818. Alabama was carved out of Mississippi in 1819, and Maine was separated from Massachusetts in 1820. Missouri joined in 1821, and after creating its territory out of Missouri, Arkansas was admitted to the Union in 1836. Michigan became part of the Union in 1837. Maine was admitted as a free state so that Missouri could be recognized as a slave state. Side note, yes, there were certain states that were designated as slave states and free states. They made sure they had one slave state for every free state. The free states had slaves as well. Back to the book. During this expansion period, more European immigrants were arriving in America as more Africans were being enslaved. As the white settlers were being granted land and opportunity, slaves were being shipped and sold to different parts of America as slavery was shifting to the southern states. You know, it was like, side note, the northern states, they had people who came around that are called Quakers, and they were the white people who actually helped the slaves get free. But we'll talk about them in just a second. Back to the book. In the northern states, like Pennsylvania, free black people and anti-slavery white citizens were organizing to abolish slavery. This movement, which started around 1780, birthed the Underground Railroad for runaway slaves. The abolitionist movement is said to have helped 100,000 slaves escape bondage. The most famous black abolitionists on record are Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Stephen Myers, all of whom escaped slavery through the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass was the most outspoken, known for his anti-slavery writings that include more than 40 books and recorded speeches. Harriet Tubman, also known as the Black Moses, freed hundreds of slaves along the Underground Railroad. Stephen Myers owned a newspaper in Albany, New York, and organized safe havens that aided runaway slaves if they needed, places to hide or rest on their way to Canada. My history books told me the watered down stories of Douglass and Tubman, but I encourage any true seeker of knowledge to Google or whatever kind of searching you have to do, even if it's finding some old books that your grandparents, great-grandparents may have kept around and the family still has them. But yes, find the true story of all the abolitionists of the early 1800s. That was a side note. Back to the book. To counter the abolitionists, Congress implemented the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This states that a master, his agent, or attorney has the power to arrest his fugitive from labor, and the slave has to pay the master $500. President George Washington is also on record complaining about Quakers, white anti-slavery colonists. helping his runaway slaves to escape to freedom. Upon their return, the slaves were beaten mercilessly and sometimes sold to other plantation owners. So not only were escaped slaves hunted like animals, they would owe a debt if they were captured. According to Wikipedia, the slave catching industry expanded as a result of the law, with bounty hunters capturing and returning many slaves to their owners. In return, many northern states adopted personal liberty laws to protect free Black Americans. As the population continued to explode, Spain was losing its grip on the territory in Spanish America. Napoleon was experiencing revolts at home and abroad in what is known as Mexico. The Mexicans fought for and won their independence in 1810. At that time, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California, Florida, the Panhandle of Oklahoma, a portion of Kansas, like half of Colorado, and part of Wyoming were all considered Mexico, which before that was New Spain, right? White settlers moving to Texas were allowed to bring their Black slaves with them. Texas colonists, both Mexican and white, refused to accept the Mexican national government under the control of President General Santa Anna. Santa Anna decided to pay them a visit. This sparked the Texas Revolution in October of 1835, which lasted until April of 1836. The Battle of the Alamo, which still stands in San Antonio, is one of the stories most told throughout history. The Alamo is also where slaves were sold. General Sam Houston defeated President General Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto to end the Texas Revolution. San Jacinto was later renamed Houston in his honor, and Sam Houston went on to become the president of the Republic of Texas in October of 1836. The Mexican War, like the Texas Revolution, was fought over federalism and slavery, immigration rights, the cotton industry, and above all else, capitalism, money. This was a war over all the other territories of Florida, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, California, and everything in between the coasts. It lasted from 1846 to 1848 and was said to be because of the westward expansion of the United States to the Pacific Ocean, dubbed Manifest Destiny. The phrase, coined in 1845, expressed that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. Manifest Destiny was by any means necessary, from sea to shining sea. Not all of these states became a part of the United States immediately, but Florida was admitted in 1845 with Texas, Iowa in 1846, and Wisconsin in 1848. In 1848, gold was found in the Sacramento Valley, causing the California Gold Rush of 1849. Side note, that's where you get the term 49ers, with the San Francisco 49ers and their gold helmets. Gold and red is their colors. The San Francisco 49ers comes from the California Gold Rush of 1849. Back to the book. The state was home to nearly 7,000 Spanish Mexicans, 700 Americans, and less than half of the 300,000 Native Americans that were there when the Spanish arrived, way back like 1492 all the way up until 1600s. As they were coming, those natives and those black people were right there. And that is as told by the History Channel. They never mentioned the indigenous people who arrived between 200,000 and 600,000 years ago. But yes, they were there. Okay, man, back to the book once again. Immigrants who would later be known as 49ers flooded the region in search of gold. The population in the San Francisco Valley went from 10,000 to 100,000 in 1 year. $2 billion worth of gold was mined. California joined the Union in 1850. The undeveloped, unorganized land became known as the Wild West by 1865. Side note. Y'all see this picture right here, this guy? And this guy here was considered the first Lone Ranger. The first Lone Ranger. And his name was Bass Reed. Bass Reed was the real Lone Ranger. Like if you know who the Lone Ranger is, it's an old TV show. They had a white guy play the Lone Ranger, but he had a black mask on over his eyes. That black mask was them not really wanting to use blackface anymore, because they knew that we were watching these TVs too, and we would take that as derogatory. So they only used a black mask on the white actor's face. But the real Lone Ranger was definitely a black man. His name was Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves. Back to the book. Minnesota joined the United States in 1858 and Oregon in 1859. The 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was elected in 1860. By then, there were two political parties, Democrats and Republicans. Side note, some Republicans in Texas started this. The Republicans of Texas. They were black men. They were black politicians. Black people started the Republican Party. Over time, over the next 50 years, they were basically just erased from the Republican Party by Democratic people in the states, within the states. Like black people weren't allowed to vote Republican at all. So we've been Democratic for 100 years now, but we actually started the Republican Party. Back to the book. Lincoln was a Republican who ran for president to abolish slavery and maintain the very divided Union. The Republican Party included free black Americans. Slave owners in the southern states were threatening to leave the Union if they were not able to keep their slaves. Not only that, they wanted to expand slavery to the newly acquired territory in the West. 12 presidents before and after Lincoln owned at least one slave. The United States Census in 1860 confirms there were nearly 4 million slaves included in the population. Not only were plantation owners wealthy as a result of 240 years of slavery, but the collective states generated trillions of dollars during that period on the backs of the black people. The slave states in the South established the Confederate States of America in 1861, leaving the United States, which led to the Civil War. The war was to keep the states in the Union. President Lincoln, acknowledging the rebellious states, submitted the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. This officially freed the slaves in the Confederate States. Side note, Lincoln was not looking to free the slaves just as a moral thing, like the thing to do. He wanted to free the slaves because they pretty much wanted every state to be a slave state, no matter what. Like, not wanting to give black people any rights, any property, I'm talking nothing. Like, they wanted you to have nothing. This was still happening in 1860. So yes, they went ahead and started their own. They broke out of the Union and said, okay, we don't want to be a part of the United States no more. We'll be our own states, just the Confederate States of America. Like we don't have to be a part of that at all if we can't keep these slaves and this money. Back to the book. 38,000 black soldiers lost their lives fighting alongside Union Army soldiers. The Civil War ended in April of 1865 with the Confederates surrendering. President Lincoln was assassinated. President Lincoln was assassinated before he could enjoy a free United States of America. In 1909, the U.S. Mint placed Lincoln's face on the penny. In 1914, he was placed on the $5 bill. By 1922, the Lincoln Monument was completed in Washington, D.C. Afterwards, the monument was put on the back of both the $5 bill and the penny. The title $5.01 will serve as a reminder that not only do we have to free ourselves, but we must also embrace the help that is on the way. And that's the end of chapter 1, Fact or Fiction, from my book, $5.01. As you can see, I kind of just breezed through the slavery part. You know what I'm saying? Everything from the 1600s to us being free. I kind of did that on purpose in chapter 1. I didn't want to really talk about slavery at all. I wanted to go back before slavery. And then I take you to chapter 2, which is called From Insurrection to Emancipation. And I talk about how there was at least one major revolt or insurrection. There was at least one revolt every year that we were enslaved somewhere in the United States, whether it be the 13 colonies or Texas. Like, there were insurrections and slaves running free and the Underground Railroad, but I go and break all of that down in chapter 2. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about Black history than you knew. Do your research. Don't just believe what Mr. Marquise is saying. Go and find out the truth about all this stuff. Like But yes, I definitely thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed this Black History Faction. That was just chapter 1. If I get a good, a nice enough crowd, y'all go ahead and share this a little bit. As much crowd sharing and crowdfunding as we could build up, I may come back and do chapter 2, from insurrection to emancipation. Again, that was out of the book $5.01, a book that I'm writing. I've been writing it. I wrote the first chapter maybe 5 years ago. I wrote the second chapter. I just started writing the second chapter maybe 2 years ago. And I was writing maybe a chapter a month until until 2020. So when 2020 came, it was like, okay, something is not right. Something is not right. So I just felt like, okay, I can't meet with the kids anymore for whatever reason. I won't get into why we're going through what we're going through, but what I will say is you will get this information. Nothing can stop what is coming. You will get this information. I promise. My next presentation will be a science presentation. So yeah, Mr. Marquise is trying to give you as much as possible. I have a science presentation, and again, Mr. Marquise tutors me. Mr. Marquise tutors me at gmail.com. Mr. Marquise tutors me at protonmail.com. And we'll see you at the next presentation. Little Keepers Lit Club. I love you guys.